it changes. Let's talk a little bit about how it changes for assets held for sale. When assets are held for sale, the only real change that occurs, well, actually, I'm sorry, I should back up. There's two things. If an asset is held for sale, we check impairment at year end. If not sold. So we need to check for the impairment. There is no change in circumstances that has to occur, unlike when we're still using it in the, what we talked about prior for definite and indefinite life, indefinite life intangibles and PP&E. If something's being held for sale, you need to check it for impairment at year end or at the end of any period. So that could be a quarter. If you're, working for a publicly traded company that's doing quarterly reports, they have to do it anytime they have something held for sale in their reporting financial statements. They need to check for impairment at that date, not just year end. The difference becomes, and recall the discontinued operations, is we're looking at the difference between the book value and the fair value of the asset less cost to sell. That cost to sell is the new piece. And so we just want to subtract off any of their disposal costs in order to get the true value that we're going to recoup from disposing of this asset. If the book value is greater than the fair value less cost to sell, then we recognize an impairment loss, and it's reducing our asset to the fair value less cost to sell. I put an M in there, fair market value, fair value, it's the same thing. When we declare an asset held for sale, we have to change the classification of the asset. It can no longer be PP&E and intangible. It has to be placed in other assets. And one of the criteria for holding a long-term or non-current asset for sale is that you have to have the intent and ability to sell within a year. So it actually goes to other current assets at that point. All right. So, that's the only change. Two things. Got to check it every time if it hasn't been sold. No more change of circumstances is necessary to trigger the let's check it for impairment. When you do, all you're looking at is the book value and the fair value less cost to sell. If the book value is an overstatement of this, then you subtract the book value, or you subtract the fair value less cost to sell from the book value, and that's your impairment loss. Otherwise, it's the same idea as up here. All we're doing is netting out costs to sell from this fair value here, right? But otherwise, it's the exact same procedure. And again, remember, this is what we were doing when we were thinking about discontinued operations. And so that's why when we decided to discontinue a division and had not sold it at the end of a period, we had to check it for impairment. All right. The next piece is indefinite life intangible assets. And I will kind of need to preface this with indefinite life intangible assets that are not goodwill. So goodwill is different, but we're talking about trademarks. And I do say goodwill here, but this piece does not apply to goodwill. That's kind of a misleading part, because then I go on to say, that there's a whole new process for goodwill on the next page. But indefinite life intangible is separate for goodwill and trademarks. For non-goodwill intangibles, we have to test yearly or more frequently if prompted by the current conditions that suggest there's a reduction in value. So remember that the reason why we're testing these more frequently is because amortization is the technical, even though it is the same thing as depreciation, the technical term amortization is not applied to indefinite life intangibles. So we are not recognizing that steady reduction in book value over time. Therefore, we have to be a little more vigilant about when and whether we have to reduce the book value of one of these assets. There is no recoverability test for these assets. All we do is look at the book value and the fair value. If the book value is greater than the fair value, we impair. If the book value is less than the fair value, we don't impair, right? So again, it comes down to that idea. If the book value is overstating the fair value, then we need to impair. We don't want overstated assets on the balance sheet. So two differences from what we just looked at with the definite life PP&E and the did I say indefinite life? I did. With the definite life PP&E and with the definite life intangibles is we got to look at it every year and perhaps more frequently if prompted by economic conditions, this changes in circumstances. And in this case, we don't need the recoverability. We go straight to just comparing the book value and the fair value of the asset. But the relationship is still the same. We still want to impair when our book value is greater than what we could sell it for. So that actually is a simpler test for those. And remember, there's not many assets that fall under this, especially when you kick out goodwill. Then we're down to trademarks and franchises. So this process is really the domain of trademarks and franchises. Now we hit to goodwill impairment. And goodwill impairment is a multi-step process. And I'm going to make a couple of changes to the notes because there was a change in the procedure at the very end that affected how much impairment loss we recognize. But anyway, goodwill impairment. This is a really lengthy process. It used to be the case that we had to check it every year. But I think it was in 2017, the FASB compromised and said, all right, we understand that this is extremely costly. Why don't we allow a sort of easy out? And that easy out was what they call a qualitative assessment of whether there is more likely than not, that is a greater than 50% chance that goodwill is in need of impairment. So we don't have to go down the road of impairment if we think that it's not more than 50% likely that goodwill needs to be impaired. Right. So from the codification, and I'm not going to read through it all, and you don't have to read through it all, but just to kind of show you how these things are written in their primary form. These are all the indications that goodwill could be in need of impairment. And quite honestly, these are things you got to look for because this could be something. I mean, it would be really hard for a company to, for example, say, we have goodwill, but, given the economic conditions of 2022, we don't really think that we need a check for impairment, right? Why would that be the case? Well, the very first thing, macroeconomic conditions, right? So if macroeconomic conditions are changing, then there could be a reason to impair goodwill. And there are so many macroeconomic conditions that are all over the place right now that would indicate, yeah, we need to check it for impairment. Industry and market conditions. So like maybe customers aren't demanding our goods. Maybe there's a new player in our market that is taking revenues from us, some sort of a regulatory or political development. That's the demand kind of for the goods in the particular industry that we're within versus the general economy. Cost factors, so raw materials, gas price, right, for delivery companies, labor, all of that could have an issue. All the costs that the company face could trigger impairment to goodwill. Financial performance, declining cash flows, declining revenues as against former projections. Relevant entity specific events, they changed executive officers, bankruptcy filings, potential large litigations, the effects to a reporting unit. Yeah, okay, that one it's not really that important to get into. It's a little in the weeds. You get the idea. There are a lot of reasons why goodwill could be an issue. It's not as specific as a particular class of PP&E or a particular patent in your intangible assets, because goodwill itself arises from the entire business, right? It's not we put a book value for goodwill as a single asset on the balance sheet, but that benefit is tied to the entire operation of the company, of all its assets, its employees, its management, how it interacts with the market, the economy. It's tied to all of that, right? So it can be affected by a host of factors. Also, as a result of that sort of holistic tie to so many different facets of economic performance and operating activities, it has some issues with checking it for impairment. And this is, why it's costly why it was costly to look at impairment every year if it wasn't more likely than not that it needed to happen for goodwill. You can't separate it from the company, right? I can't purchase another company's goodwill because it's innately tied to the assets, the workforce, all of that, like I said. As a lack of association with contractual rights and privileges, right? There's no tangible contract or product that's assigned to it. It arises out of a synergy of the company. And so you can't buy it. There's no explicitly written contract that you can own. This ties back to, if you recall, when I talked about it, the only way goodwill is recorded it's only recorded when we acquire another company or the division of another company. So one of its components. Maybe one of its segment lines. Right? We can only record it when we buy that other company. And as a refresher, remember the amount that we assign when we buy it is the purchase price of the acquisition minus the fair value of net assets acquired. That gives me goodwill. That's the amount that I recorded at. And it is only recorded when I pay a premium over what I would pay for each of those assets and each of those liabilities separately. And it's really important to understand how goodwill is generated, how it's measured, in order to really get why or when we impair it in the process for impairing it. It is a tricky asset. It is one of those things that's unidentifiable. until someone decides to pay more for a group of assets than they would be worth otherwise. So that's the first step. The very first step, kind of, it's a long one because of all the verbiage I put in there from the codification. But the very first step is deciding whether it is more likely than not that goodwill is in need of impairment. These are just a few, right, of the different things that could be thought of when we're doing that. And remember that this wasn't always the case. It was due to the cost benefit constraint that the FASB decided to change from the annual evaluation, the annual required evaluation of impairment for goodwill. And instead we're like, okay, we'll give you an out. If you can establish that it is less than 50% likely that goodwill should be impaired, then you don't have to check it. And basically it goes back to that constraint. It's one of those constraints in chapter 1 that says the cost of providing information should not outweigh the benefits of providing that information. And so if it's not even likely goodwill should be impaired, then what is the benefit of going through and doing what we're just about to get into? Okay. Now, I will note for you guys, calculating goodwill impairment will not be an issue. But if, in the classroom, in the real world, it becomes extremely laborious, costly, tedious, and also fraught with a lot of potential estimation error. But anyway, we'll get to that in a second. After you decide it's more likely than not, step 2.1, we got to impair all other assets, PP&E, definite life intangibles, non-goodwill indefinite life, all the other assets. We need to check those for impairment first. We need to make sure that their book value is not overstated. And we'll see a little bit more why in a bit as we continue down this, but that is, definitely step 1. Got to check all the other items in the reporting unit that we're assessing goodwill impairment for. Because if we do not apply impairment, everything else equal, it will make it more likely to impair goodwill than we shouldn't have. And again, you'll see why in a second, but we will be more likely to impair goodwill and impairment will be overstated. All right. So then it comes to determining whether impairment is necessary for goodwill. So in order to test for impairment, then what you're looking at is not just a single asset, because remember, goodwill is tied to all of the assets of the reporting unit that we're looking at. So in order to test whether it's necessary, we're looking at the book value of the net assets versus the fair value of the net assets. It still revolves around book value and fair value. It's just no longer a single asset. We're looking at the entire division or the entire company's book value versus the fair value of that entire division or entire company. If the book value is overstating it, then it's necessary. If the book value is understating it, it is not necessary. So now is the part where I'm going to change some stuff, and it actually got much easier. So ignore this piece. Now we're just going to talk about determining the impairment loss to apply to goodwill. In order to determine the impairment loss, all you have to look at is the book value of net assets and subtract the fair value, and that equals the maximum impairment loss to be recognized. All right, so the book value, so we're looking at the inequality to determine whether it's necessary. If book value is greater than fair value, then we take the difference, and that is the maximum impairment loss to be recognized. I call it the maximum because we may recognize less. There is one caveat: cannot apply impairment loss that is greater than the book value of goodwill. Another way of stating that would be the book value of goodwill cannot be reduced past $0. So it can't go any lower than $0. So we got to recognize an impairment amount, and we can reduce it all the way to 0, but we can't go any further than that. So if this told me 300,000 and goodwill had a book value of 150,000, I could only apply $150,000 impairment. So I can't get it past 0. It can't go negative. Therefore, we limit the impairment loss to the book value of goodwill.